Okay.
It's right here. It's right here.
Okay, is that big enough?
Yeah.
A little bigger?
A little bigger?
Always,
Okay.
always a little bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. So bigger.
Do one more.
One more, okay. Yeah,
Nothing. Yeah.
That's good. Yep.
That's good.
okay. All right, so we are in the double parsha this week of Matot-Masei, and with it, it's hard to believe we're going to come to the end of Sefer Bamidbar.
That was fast.
Yeah, I know, it was fast. So this is, for many, one of the more challenging parshiot, especially Masei. The beginning of Parshat Masei gives a very detailed account of every place that Bnei Israel stopped in their 40-year journey in the desert, and it lists every place. And there's a lot. We spent 1 year, I think, delving a little bit into that. You know, everyone wants to know why we care about the name of every stop on the journey. But we're going to focus today on the beginning of this double parsha with the beginning of Matot, and we'll start in source number 1. Vaydaber Moshe el Roshei HaMatot livnei Yisrael lemor, zeh hadavar asher tzivah Hashem. Moshe spoke to the heads of the tribes, saying, "This is what God has commanded. Ish ki dor neder la Hashem, o hishava shvuah le'esor isar nafsho, lo yachel devaro kechol yotzei mipiv ya'aseh." If a person makes a vow or takes an oath to forbid something to himself, he shall not, we'll translate it as defile his words, but everything that emerges from his mouth, he should do. Then it gets into the more complicated situation of if a woman makes a vow or an oath while still living in her father's home at sort of the transitional point in her life, and who has the authority to verify or annul those vows? Is it her father or her husband when she gets married? Does someone have a TV going in the background?
Let me close the door. Wait a minute. My husband's watching the ball game.
Okay, it's just I'm getting a lot of noise.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
Yeah.
That's better. Yeah, slowly. That's better.
Okay, that's better, Cheryl. Thank you.
Yeah, it's still coming through.
Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so this is the section in the Torah where we're introduced to the concept of vows. We're familiar with vows of Nidarim from Yom Kippur. We say Kol Nidre, and we preemptively nullify any vow that we'll make in the future, or the vows that we've made in the previous year. Before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, many of us have the custom of making Hatarat Nidarim, again, a more formal nullification of vows. And this is the main place in the Torah where we're introduced to it. The Ibn Ezra asks a question. He asks it in a little bit of a roundabout way, but the basic question is, why here? Why is this the place where the Torah delves into the concept of vows? What's special about this situation, about this location? And so he does it by saying that we have a basic debate when it comes to the Torah about, and we've mentioned this many times. Does the Torah follow a chronological order or not, or is there some other organizing logic behind why things appear in the order that they appear? So generally, it's safe to assume that the Torah follows a chronological order, but if there's a reason why it should depart, then it does depart. So he says, Lefi da'ati, I believe, Shazota Parshaita Achar Milchemet Midyan, that this description of the vows really came after the war with Midian. Ki achareha, which is a little bit later on in the parsha, and just so everyone gets a sense of what we're talking about, so we see that our parsha, the verses that we're looking at, appear in chapter 30. Beginning with verse 2, if we scroll down a little bit, in chapter 31, we have Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, Nikom Mikmat Bnei Israel Me'et HaMidyanim Achar Tiasef El Amecha. God tells Moshe to instruct Bnei Israel that they should seek revenge against the Midianites, and then Moshe will die. וידבר משה אל העם לאמור, היחלצו מאתכם אנשים לצבא, ויהיו על מדיין, לתת נקמת השם במדיין. And so Moshe then tells the Jewish people that they should go and fight Midian and take revenge against them. And so there's a little bit of a discussion about what exactly are we seeking revenge for against Midian? Is it connected to the, right, is Midian and Moab one and the same, such that we're seeking revenge for the the seduction of the women, or is there something else? But we have a war with Midian a bit later in the parsha. And then it's noted also that if we go back even further to Parshat Pinchas, that, and let me just make sure I have the right, so last week we read about Pinchas, and we read about right? He rises up, he kills the people that were sinning and committing a Chilul Hashem, and he's rewarded with the covenant of peace and with Brit Kunat Olam, with priesthood. And then immediately after that, right? So then we think that the next section is the census, where we go through, and then, right, the census is a way to, it sort of bridges into the discussion of Slavchad and Benot Slavchad, his daughters. But right before that, we have this one verse. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Source number 6 in chapter 25, right? So we have in source 6 the description of what Pinchas does and his reward. And then if we pick up in verse 16 here, over here, right? Aber Hashem al Moshe Lemor, Sarorat HaMidyanim v'hikitem otam. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, assail the Midianites and defeat them. Ki tzorerim heim lachem benichlehem, asher niku lachem al devar pa'or, al devar kozbi vat nesim Midian, achotam umukah b'yom ha'magefa al devar pa'or. For they assailed you by the trickery they practiced against you because of the affair of Pa'or, and because of the affair of their kinswoman Cosbi, the daughter of the Midianite chieftain, who was killed at the time of the plague on account of Peor. So if we put this together, and I apologize, I was a little bit all over the place, but we have Pinchas, and then right after Pinchas, we have this initial commandment to go and fight against the Midianites, and it seems that that's a direct retribution, a direct a vengeance for the sin that Pinchas rose up against. And then we have chapters 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. Then in 31, the narrative seems to pick up again with the actual waging of battle against the Midianites. So the first question is, what's going on in between? Why do we have this break in the narrative? And that's like sort of the roundabout way that the Ibn Ezra tells us that he thinks this section of vows is out of place. It's out of chronological order. So the question is why we have the interruption. And just to give a bit of a recap, this is just a summary of everything that appears in those chapters that are in our ellipse, in our 3 dots, right? So we have assail the Midianites, chapters 26 through 30. And included in those is as follows, right? At the very top of this page, we have the census of Bnei Israel. And that's followed, or that's an introduction to the petition of Binot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, who say, it's during the census, the point of the census is to determine how much land each tribe will be given, will be allotted when they enter the land. And that's passed through the father of each family. And so Tzlofchad's daughters come and they say, our father didn't have any sons. Why should he lose? Why should our family lose out? Why should his name be lost? And so Moshe brings their petition to Hashem. Hashem says they're correct. They should inherit. And so we have that whole issue, followed by, and this is what I spoke about in Shul on Shabbos, God's command to Moshe to ascend to Har HaAvarim, and where he's told he's gonna die and he's not gonna lead them in. He asks God to appoint Yehoshua, or to appoint a leader. God says it will be Yehoshua. And then we have, if you remember from last week in Shul, the second half of Parshat Pinchas deals with all of the what he calls the public sacrifices. We have the Korban Tami, the daily sacrifice, and we have all the Musaf offerings, all the various offerings on the holidays and Shabbos, or Rosh Chodesh. That's how Parshat Pinchas concludes. And then we have this section of the vows. The Torah goes into much more detail about the situation we already mentioned, about if a girl makes a vow, is she living in her father's home? Is she living under her husband? Which one of them has authority to affirm or to nullify the vows? And then we come to the continuation of our story with Midian. So interesting is that one more piece. On a simple pshat level, it seems that the reason why Nidarim, Parshat Matot, opens with vows is because the second to last verse in Parshat Pinchas is found here in source number 3. Eila ta'asula Hashem b'moadechem, right? So it's told us all the different sacrifices that are offered on each of the various holidays. These are what you should offer to God on your holidays. Livad minidrechem v'nidvotechem v'olotechem u'leminchotechem l'skeichem u'lishamechem. In addition to your nidarim, to your vows, or your voluntary offerings, or your olot, your elevation offerings, your meal offerings, in addition to all the other offerings you have to bring. So since in the course of mentioning the offerings that are brought, it mentions the offerings associated with a neder, that seems to be on a simple reason why the Torah then tells us about nidarim, because it's already been introduced, as it were. But it still doesn't explain why there's this major break in the narrative between the initial commandment to go to war against Midian and the follow-up. So is everyone with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It was a little bit of a long-winded way to get there. So I saw this really interesting explanation from Professor Rabbi Yonatan Grossman. I think we've seen some of his stuff before. And he says that if we look at all the things that interrupt our narrative, it's 6 events that are really 3. And he says that these 3 or 6 topics are really the bridge from Pinchas. Meaning what? Meaning what's the story of Pinchas?
That he kills Cosby and Zimri.
He kills Cosby and Zimri, right?
And then he becomes, like, his special task is to lead Bnei Israel against the Midianim.
Right. So Pinchas is celebrated because Bikano et kinati mitoch Bnei Israel. We spoke about this many times before. He acted zealously. He's a zealot. And there's a huge debate over whether this zealotry of Pinchas is something to be emulated or something to be discouraged. So fascinating sources. I didn't bring any of them here, but right. So one of my favorites, or more, one that intrigues me, says that as Cosby and Zimri are engaged in this act of sin, right? And remember, it's the Einei Kol Ha'edah, it's in front of everyone. So they're doing this egregious act in public, and as the Medrash tells us in at least one source, Bnei Israel come to Moshe and they say, Moshe, look what's happening. What are we supposed to do about it? And Moshe freezes. And the Medrash tells us, Nitz alma halacha mimenu, that he forgot what the law is in this situation. There's all sorts of, what do you mean he forgot the law? It's very clear what the law is, so he forgot some of the details. But anyway, Moshe froze. And it was Pinchas who rises up and acts zealously and does what has to be done. So that's really, in one sense, highlighting what becomes, I think, clearer. But that Pinchas represents sort of, if Moshe is stuck trying to remember or recreate or follow to the T what the strict law on the books is, Pinchas is the zealot who goes beyond that. Pinchas is the one who intuits this is what has to be done, even if Moshe can't cite for me which seif, which section in the Shulchan Aruch it's found in. We know what has to be done. And so what Rabbi Grossman wants to suggest is that all these other things that interrupt the narrative also sort of are playing on this tension. On the one hand, right, we have the census, where it's very clear what the rules are and how the land is supposed to be passed on. But then it gets sort of qualified or modified by the unique situation of Benot Tzlofchad. And so it's fascinating that when Hashem answers Moshe's question about the daughters of Tzlofchad, the answer isn't just, yes, Benot Tzlofchad should inherit for their father, but the answer is Benot Tzlofchad and anyone else in this situation. It sets a precedent, and it modifies what seems to be the original law. Hashem tells Moshe that you're going to die, right? That you're not going to be the one to lead Bnei Yisrael in, and that's sort of like the fact that Moshe has to confront. And then Moshe is again, it's not that this wasn't part of the plan, but Moshe brings to light the fact that there has to be a leader. That, right, just saying Moshe can't lead them in, just enforcing that strict rule is insufficient or inadequate for what's needed. What's needed is for Moshe to say, well, let there be a leader, and let that, and then Hashem says, okay, Yoshua will be the leader. Then we come to, right, we have all the description of the mandatory sacrifices that have to be brought. And the Torah recognizes at the very end that there's also a situation of voluntary sacrifices. So what he wants to claim is that we have emerging with Pinchas is this theme or this tension which all of us feel at some point in our lives, committed to halacha and committed to following the rules, that sometimes the law on the books seems to be inflexible or not speaking directly to us in our situation. And so we have to qualify that written law with the next detail, the next sort of modifying event that shows us that there is flexibility and that there is room for adaptation to the unique and personal situations that people find themselves in. And so he says that's why we have this interruption. It's an interesting theory. You can. I think I gave the link, and you can check out and see if you agree with his full analysis. But he says that's basically why we have this interruption here, really to drive home this point that the end of Sefer Bamidbar, it's the transition moment. They're not going to have the ability of Moshe to ask God directly what the halacha should be. And so we have to, the Torah is making a point of driving home that there is a flexibility and there is room for personal application of these seemingly immutable and and unchangeable laws, that there is more flexibility built into the system. That's why we have this interruption in the narrative. Any thoughts or questions on that?
What does
I
it
think
mean
it's
at
a
the,
help. I really do. I do like it. I mean, the overall problem is what to do about how to engage in the physical world, which is not anymore in the desert.
Right.
And so they've got to learn how to set their own boundaries, to do their own things too in this whole new context. And the first time they tried it, they failed, or at least a group of them did.
Yeah.
They thought they could be stronger than they were. And so the question is how to make oneself strong, but at the same time capable of being creative and change when it's necessary. I mean, it's a very interesting literary point. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of it. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
what is the sixth section? Vows taken by a woman or a girl?
Oh, that's how he summarized it, meaning because the Torah
Uh-huh.
goes into more detail about the situation of a woman or a girl who's in her father's house or about to be married. So, meaning like in the Gemara, that's sort of how, that's a lot of the discussion of it, but it's vows in general.
I like it builds in the possibility for a generation passing from the time of the mitzvot,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there's those 40 years, and we basically go from, I think you said this a few weeks back, from year 1 to year 40, right? And so I like the fact that it sets up like this is what they're told in terms of nachala, but like 40 years later, when it's getting ready to go in, there's this amendment to that law, and it establishes, that's how I understood it, this sort of amendment, right?
Yeah.
Moshe is the teacher, amendment, Yoshua is going to be the teacher, right? And public sacrifices that were pretty much being done by the Kohanim, amendment. Now we're talking about like the optional.
Right, and playing
Um,
even more into that, right, is what happens later on in the Parsha is that the relatives of Benot Slavchad come back to Moshe and they say, wait a second, you just said that Slavchad's daughters are going to inherit, but if they marry someone from a different tribe, then our tribe is going to have less land as a result, because the land will transfer to their husband and their sons, who take on the tribal identity of the father. So Moshe says, oh, that's another good question, right? So we have this ongoing dialogue, right, which is an interesting precursor to the halachic system and halachic give and take as we know it.
does he follow through? Is there any sort of update in terms of Srorat Mijanim to Nikom Nikmat Bnei Israel Meta Mijanim? Like we see that also as a
Yeah, not that I saw.
He doesn't. Okay.
Not that I saw. He says, but that's the interruption to the narrative to highlight that this point has to be made. So yeah, I don't know if that can fit into the pattern or not. I didn't see anything about it.
I'll look into it.
Okay.
Well, the Midianites problem is a more serious one in a way than the Moabite problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
How
different
so?
one. They're more like Amalek. I mean,
Okay.
where Amalek comes in,
Right.
And there is an outright denial of the presence of God in the midst. As we learn that from various other places in the Torah. That's the mindset. There's really no need for any deities here. Whereas the Moabites were concerned about somebody coming through and taking their land as well. The Midianites don't have land. They don't think of their lives in that way. They're
Mm-hmm.
marauders. So so they come and look for people who are vulnerable and then take advantage of them. And they try to cool down our enthusiasm for Torah and mitzvahs and so on. That's a much deeper level of evil, but it's at the root of what the problem was with the Moabites also. So it's a more profound problem. But I guess you're asking, does it fit into this presentation or not? And there probably is a way to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So we have some homework.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was sort of part one. Part two is I wanted to delve a little bit more into this notion of vows. And again, I don't think there's anything that's such major chiddush in what we're going to say, but there is a very rich discussion over the place of vows in religious life and Jewish life. Again, we don't really encounter it as much. You know, some of us or some of our friends or relatives that are really from will say beli neder when they say that they're gonna, you know, meet you for lunch or whatever, beli neder. So we encounter vows in that context. We encounter vows before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It's not really a regular part of our life, but there is something very rich and interesting about it. So we'll start with the Rambam in Shmona Prakim, which is his introduction to his commentary on Pirkei Avot. And we'll just, in this place source, just quote the Yerushalmi he quotes at the end. So in the Hebrew, we're up here at the top of the page, and in the English, where it says in the Palestinian Talmud, which is in italics. So in the Yerushalmi, the Rambam quotes, "Chachaminu v'chachamim b'zeh inyan davar lo shamati kol yoter nifla mimenu." So the rabbis have a really great rule, which I've not heard any better articulation of it. V'hu b'gemaru t'bnei marava b'perek tishia Nidarim. It's in the Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, in the 9th chapter of Nidarim. Davar miganot hamikablim al atzmam shvuot nidarim ad shisharu ke'ein asurim. So it says that they speak negatively, they speak badly about those who accept upon themselves oaths or vows, such that they see the object as forbidden. Amru Shem b'zeh halashon, and he quotes now, Rav Idi b'shem Rabbi Yitzchak, Lo dayecha ma she'asra lecha haTorah, ela she'ata oser alecha dvarim acherim. It's not enough for you what the Torah forbade, but you're forbidding even further, even additional things on yourself. You take a neder, you take a vow, I'm not going to eat that delicious piece of steak. So it's not enough that the Torah said you can't have pork, you can't have a cheeseburger, you can't have a crab, a shrimp, whatever. But now you're also forbidding something that the Torah never forbade you. Like it's saying it in a very disparaging way. Okay. So he quotes this Yerushalmi, and that seems, that's one theme that runs throughout the writings of the Rambam. So if we look in Hilchot Deot, which is where he, it's translated as the law of human dispositions, I think. He says, Shema Yomar Adam, Hoil Vakina Vatava Vakavod Vachayote Behem, Derech Ra'ahin, Motina Tadamina Olam, Efrosh Mehen Bioter Vachachik Litzad Ha'acharon. So he says there's all sorts of jealousy, lust, honor, are all bad, and they remove a person from the world, whatever that means. So I'm going to separate from them and go to the other extreme. To the point that a person won't eat meat, and he won't drink wine, and he won't get married, and they won't live in a nice home, and they won't wear nice clothing. Ella hasak vatsemer, right? They'll just wear sack and sackcloth of it. V'chayose bahen kegon konei ovdei kochavim, right? Like we see Catholic priests who live a life of poverty. This is also an evil. This is also a bad way, which is forbidden. And someone who does this is called a sinner. As it says, and we discussed this, that the Nazir has to bring a sin offering. So, right, there's technical differences between a neder and a shvua and a nazir, but it's all the same general idea of making a voluntary assertion that something should be forbidden, which wasn't initially forbidden to you.
Excuse me, Rabbi, I disagree
Yes.
with you on that. I really do. There's a big difference between a neder and a shavua. The shavua has to do with a positive mitzvah. You know,
Okay.
so I'm going to do,
Yes, yes. There's
I'm going to go ahead and going to do X, Y, or Z, but I'll say believe better because maybe something will intervene in the meantime that I wouldn't have anticipated and I won't be able to do it.
so
But a
you're
vow is involved with
absolutely,
the thing. Yeah.
absolutely that there is technical distinctions. Neder generally has to be on an object, or a shvua is on the person. Um, and there could be a shvua for positive, or for negative. And you could have a neder to do something positive, like a neder shimshon. But the general idea of um, making a voluntary statement on something that wasn't there, that's how they're all sort of being grouped together here. So anyway, so there he quotes and he says that it's a sin to abstain from things which are permitted. Um, in Hilchot Nidarim, in the laws of vows, in source number 9, he says, Amu chachamim kol hanoder ki'ilu bana bama. So he quotes another Gemara from Nidarim, whoever makes a vow, it's as if they've built a bama. Who knows what a bama is?
Like Mizbech outside of the area of the Beit
A
Mikdash.
personal altar, an altar outside of the Beit HaMikdash. So there was a period in Jewish history when that was the only way that you could offer a sacrifice. But once the Mishkan was established, once the Beit HaMikdash was built, so then offering sacrifices outside on your own personal bama was seen as a very grave sin. So the rabbis say that anyone who makes a neder is if they built a bama. Imavar v'nadar mitzvah lihishael al nidro kadei shelo yehei michshol lefanav. And if a person does transgress and makes a vow, it's a mitzvah to ask to like what we call to be matir, to nullify the vow, in order that there won't be a stumbling block in front of him. And this is partially to your point. Bamed varim amurim. When does this apply? Benidre iser, when it comes to a vow of abstention, a vow forbidding something to yourself. Aval nidre hekdesh mitzvah lekaiman. But if you make a neder to do something positively, to take on, and there's a whole fascinating discussion whether you can make a neder, whether you can make a shvua to fulfill a mitzvah, to do something that you're supposed to do, or is this talking about going above and beyond what's required of you? So that's a whole other fascinating concept, and we have an idea of mushpa ve'omed mehar Sinai that we already had a shvua, a vow, sorry, an oath imposed on us or accepted willingly from Har Sinai. So therefore, you can't take another shvua for a mitzvah, but maybe a neder you can take. Interesting things, right? There's an entire tractate of Nidarim that gets into all these questions. Question of the neder chal al neder, if you've already made a vow, can you make a second vow for the same thing, or is sort of a useless statement? But anyway, if you make a more positive vow, then it's a mitzvah to fulfill it. V'lo yisha'el aleihen ela midochak, and you shouldn't nullify them unless there's some really strong pressing reason. Shne'emar nidrei lashem hashalem, as we say in Hallel, I will fulfill my vows to God.
Does adopting chumras
Yeah.
of whatever types, but regarding the quality of the knots on a garment, or the shape of the hat, or the nature of the head covering that a married woman might put, would the adoption of such chumras also potentially involve making one's own unauthorized additions?
So that's an interesting question. On the one hand, just to keep it local for a second before we come to your real question, if someone has followed a chumrah for an extended period of time and now for whatever reason wants to drop that chumrah, so oftentimes they will have to make hatarat nidarim in order to be allowed to do that. So so chumrah certainly falls into this discussion. whether, in general, what we say about chumrot is that if they're done with the recognition that it's a chumrah, that it's a stringency, and going beyond what's strictly required, so that's a very different situation than if you think this is what I have to do.
There's an element with humorous, they're adopted by a broad community,
Right.
or people who think of themselves as the broader community,
Yeah.
that it becomes coercion on other people who, for whatever reasons, either can't afford the particular kind of Borsalino hat that is now the only recognized, whatever it might be in a particular circumstance. Um, there, there are issues potentially, I think, of people possibly being manipulated or bullied or shamed into adopting certain practices or certain standards that they wouldn't adopt, except they're afraid Mayom Ruha Yehudim, but in the neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and that might apply to an issue of mowing a lawn, not mowing a lawn, having a lawn, having a garden, having a playground, not having a playground.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
so it's an interesting intersection of the concepts. Again, I don't want to get too technical with all this, but what falls under the rubric of minhag and what's under the rubric of chumrah, and those are really interesting questions. And then there's a separate issue of, okay, so we have these categories. When do they become binding on a broader community? Also, interesting questions. That's a little bit, it's certainly connected to what we're talking about, but it's also a little bit of a different situation and question. But yes, in general, the notion of chumrah would fall into this discussion, I think. And so it's very much relevant. So thank you for raising it. Okay, so the Ran tells us in number 10, explains this this Gemara that says that making a vow is akin to building a bama. And so he first says, Hanoder kilu bana bama bishat isur habamot. It's like building a bama when bamot are forbidden. There was a time in history, which Avi said, when we were allowed to build them and even encouraged to them. V'niri be'enai, says this is why I think it's compared to building a bama. Right? Because the person who makes a neder thinks they're doing a mitzvah and a great act. I'm not sure he means mitzvah in a technical sense here, or more just like a good thing. Because God forbade something, and this person is also forbidding something upon themselves. The Ka'amar Detai, but really the rabbis are saying he's mistaken. The Adarabba, on the contrary, Lebone Bama Dame, he's really akin to building a Bama. Dinehi Drachmana Azhare Lakuve Korbanot Bifnim Azhare Lo Losif Ale Libnot Bama Ulahakrik Bachutz. Because when God commanded to offer a sacrifice, God commanded that it should be offered in the Beit HaMikdash, and not that it should be offered outside the Beit HaMikdash. Hachanami. So too in our case of a vow, the Hidra Rachmana Asar Ale Devarim Hasurim, granted that God forbade forbidden things. God told us what's forbidden. Kimosif Ihu Amai da Asar Rachmana. But this person is adding on to what God already forbid. Pasha Keinan Shamru Yushami, and he quotes the same Gemara that the Rambam quoted earlier. That you think you're outsmarting God, right? God told us what's forbidden, I'm going to make even more things forbidden. So we have a very strong camp that sees this whole thing of vows as, right, and we can perhaps add to that, right, with some qualifications, the notion of chumrah, a real danger of Perhaps it leads to a sense of yuhara, of religious sort of one-upsmanship, that you think you're better than other people because you're acting more firm than them, or that, in a real philosophical sense, that you're taking on this godlike quality of creating prohibitions where there are no prohibitions. So that's a real danger. But at the same time, the Rambam says in source number 11, and there are a few other sources that follow, Misha nadar nidarim kedei lechonein deotav l'takein ma'asav, harei zariz meshubach. If someone makes a neder in order to establish proper character traits and correct your conduct, so that's praiseworthy. Kesad. Kigon Misha yazolel va'asar alav habasar shana oshtayim. If someone's like a real glutton, and they forbid eat. They say I'm not going to eat meat for a certain period of time for about a year. A year, we're used to, was it no meat Mondays or fasting, intermittent fastings or whatever. So right, so I'll abstain from meat from a certain time. Or someone who has problems with wine, so it says I'm not going to drink wine for a certain amount of time. Or says I'll never drink alcohol. Okay, right. So someone who seeks various pleasures or gifts or whatever, right? We can all think of things that it's worthwhile to abstain from, or to really sort of go cold turkey. When I was in high school, I had a real problem playing video games for a while, and one day I was able to just say, "That's it, I'm done." And like there's things that we recognize we should stay away from, and that are big time sucks, and that do take away from proper religious life, and that's praiseworthy. The Rambam says. So I think it's clear where we're going here is that there has to be a balance here, right? That as Robert says, we have we live in a world in a Jewish world which has a seeming growing obsession with chumrot, and there's interesting explanations for why that might be the case. I don't know if anyone remembers. I can't even remember when, but we discussed maybe on a Shabbos Shuva drasha at some point. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik's fascinating article, Rupture and Reconstruction, where he talks about the sociology of the Orthodox community and the move away from a mimetic tradition to to everything has to be rooted in Sfarim. And so that contributes greatly to the Chumrah mentality that our community has. So the basic message is we need balance. It's this coming Friday is the yahrzeit of Amital, whom I sort of I had the privilege of hearing talk. I didn't have a real relationship, or I can't really say I was a student while he was alive, but certainly someone who has greatly influenced me. He was he was the founding Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion and one of the founders of the Hesder movement in Israel. And there's in the later in his life became heavily involved in Israel politics as a voice of moderation from the religious camp. Really interesting, important figure. So he writes on this whole topic. Taken at face value, this scenario does not seem to be negative, right? The scenario of taking a vow. On the contrary, the person is motivated by the desire to accept upon himself more obligations. However, one must know where he stands in his avodat Hashem. There is no reason to desert the multitude of commandments which we are bound to fulfill in search of more. Who are you to think that you have exhausted the 613 mitzvot, which are the most basic level of observance? The issue of Nidarim parallels a phenomenon which is widespread, Robert, this comes to your point, throughout the contemporary world of Jewish observance. Often Orthodox Jews dismiss what the halacha requires of them as being undignified and opt for chumrot, or stricter adherence to the laws. I strongly object to this ubiquitous practice. It must rather remain the province of rare individuals of great spiritual attainments, often by taking on a stricter level of observance, which exceeds what God requires of us. We lose the spiritual component in our worship and instead become overly ritualistic. Instead, we should recognize who we are and not deem ourselves above the basic level of observance. Okay, so the real danger of the mentality and of if you overly rely on chumrots or external motivation, such as a vow, to do what you know is the religiously and spiritually correct thing to do, it can lead to a sort of spiritual deadening. Um, um, okay, we can skip the next one. Actually, no. The Chidushe Harim, who is the grandfather of the Sfas Emes. So the Sfas Emes quotes his grandfather often. The Sfas Emes's father died when the Sfas Emes was a child. He was basically raised by his grandfather and then took over as the Rebbe of the Gur dynasty for him. So the Chidushe Harim says that, again, striking this balance of so what do we do with this idea of vows? And he points to Yaakov. Yaakov makes a neder after he has his dream, and he says that if God will do everything that he said he's going to do for me, so then I will offer sacrifices, and God will be my God. Everyone raises questions. How could Yaakov set up this conditional in his relationship with Hashem? But the Chidush HaRim makes a separate point. He says basically that Yaakov makes a neder at that point because he had a moment of inspiration, and he knew that moments of inspiration are fleeting and that he might feel like he's on spiritual fire, as it were, at this moment following the great dream. But in 2 days' time, he might forget it. So he has to concretize it in some way. And so he made a neder, he made a vow in order to concretize and memorialize that feeling. Says that's a very positive use of the concept of a neder. That if you do it in order to perpetuate those feelings of inspiration, so that's great. But again, it's not something that should be done all the time. And then finally, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, we're told, who, again, the world of Hasidus is its own world with its own, it's its own calculations and everything. And Rabbi Nachman in the world of Hasidus is his own world and his own calculations of everything. But we're told in Shivchei Moharan, in source number 16, which is sort of the biography accounts of Rabbi Nachman, written by his main student, Rabbi Natan, tells us that Rabbi Nachman would make vows often, that he used vows as a way to inspire himself and propel himself forward. He made very common use of vows, for on many occasions when the day arrived, he accepted upon himself by way of a vow the entire order of service that he wished to perform on that day, and then afterwards, even if it was exceedingly difficult for him, he was forced to act on account of the vow. He acted in this manner on many occasions. On many occasions, he would erect all kinds of fences of abstention from certain desires or qualities by way of vows. He would often take an oath about certain matters while holding a holy object, so he would be strong enough to abstain from whatever it was that he wished to abstain from. Okay, so we have, we have this really interesting concept of nidarim, of vows, which, as we saw at the beginning of the shiur, are a way to allow us some of that flexibility and some of that applying the more universal Torah law to our specific life circumstances. And we can all think of situations and times when making a vow or making some sort of broader, stronger commitment is worthwhile, either because of temptations that we have or downfalls that we have, or wanting to, as the Chidushei Harim did, wanting to concretize those moments of great inspiration, wanting to go above and beyond. And that can be very healthy, but there's also a great downfall, both on a theological sense that it can give the feeling or the sense that one is acting too godly, and only God should act godly and we should act humanly. And also that it can be spiritually deadening, that you just becomes a different set of laws that you're bound to without having any of the spiritual significance or meaning that the Torah and the mitzvot intend for us. So again, it's a very common theme, and it's one that we have spoken about in different contexts, and I'm sure we will again. But it was interesting for me to think about Nidarim in this way, and to get that piece of the structure of the end of Sefer Bamidbar was also quite interesting, I thought. Any final thoughts on any of this?
I'd like to offer just something that occurred to me from behavioral psychology, if I might.
Uh-huh.
It's funny how the research kind of overlaps with so many, of these things. But if a person comes to do something 3 times,
Yeah.
it's like the training to learn something, perhaps in a way. But once it becomes done 3 times, one tends to see oneself as someone who does it. And so it begins to take on halachically a category of minhag, which then can become almost like a mitzvah, right? It kind of gets into
So
that realm.
halachically,
So it
that would be
intersects
called a chazaka, a presumption that you're going to
right.
continue to do the same thing,
Yeah,
right?
so we're entering into the territory that Robert brought up too through that mode.
Yeah.
But this time when I learned what was here, in the past I've just revolted against it because I was thinking, well, why is God given the right to one man to do X, Y, or Z? That kind of thing. I was just feeling really rebellious about the whole thing. But this time when I saw that in thinking about the development of a young person, that the father can annul the vow a of a daughter,
Yeah, or
because
of a young son,
he
yeah.
feels that she may be ready actually to take it on in a healthy way as part of her repertoire of good things or to do or things to avoid, and she no longer needs the vow to do it. So that's another way of looking at this. I think a way of kind of trying out a behavior with some compulsion, but then withdrawing it, so that it can then become part of a more flexible repertoire with creativity still there in the
Hmm.
background.
That's an
So I,
interesting
I
spin
see
on it.
I
Yeah.
see it as this is kind of like a developmental set of stages in the
Oh,
life of a person, and the boundaries can keep changing, in ways. But there's this whole realm that's called Klippa Noga, where it's not a positive mitzvah or a negative mitzvah. Those are clear. They're in the realm of Kedusha. But then there's this other whole realm where we have to set boundaries for ourselves, and each person kind of has to set their boundaries and know how to take them down when it's necessary and to move them into another space within the self, that kind
uh-huh.
of thing.
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
just it just hit me that there's so much in the behavioral psychology literature that actually overlaps with a lot of these things.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Sometimes I think that maybe one can identify where a woman lives by how she covers her head.
That's could be true. That could be true.
Yes.
I
All
think
right.
it's. Wanted to just share also that I think we're looking. It's so neat to see Rambam saying like these are the things of Kohenei Avodah Zarah,
Yeah.
right? And seeing them as like very Christian things, and that Rambam is trying to kind of push back on that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then to see at the end the Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who's sort of embracing that idea, right? Like Rabbi Nachman wants to be like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and it seems like within the context of what Rambam's speaking about, this is exactly what Rambam means as like, no, this
Right.
is not what we do when we take
Right.
Nidarim, right? And yet the whole Chassidut movement was that the tzaddik and the Rebbe will be the I guess interconnector with God, right? And
Right.
so they're trying to be so they sort of take on for themselves. It's really neat. It's almost like we've struggled with this concept of nidarim as Jews throughout history, based on not just the psychology, but also like what are other societies and cultures doing around us? Right?
Yeah.
Do we have to take on extra? And for a true religion, why would you have to take on anything extra to achieve what God wants you to do? It's right there, right? And
Exactly.
so
Yeah. Interesting.
it's really cool. I like
Interesting.
that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Thank you,
night.
Rabbi.
And
All right.
we'll see you hopefully in Shul over Shabbos and
Yeah.
back at it next Tuesday.
Very
Yes.
good. Thank you,
Perfect.
Rabbi.
So-
All right. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good night.
Good night.